Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, Episode 4, Algeria. So today we talk about our first African country. Algeria makes up a huge part of Africa. It right now is the largest country in Africa and the 10th largest in the world. However, this can be a little deceiving, as despite its huge size, most of it is desert, with the north coast holding the vast majority of the population. Algeria is located right along the Mediterranean Sea, with it making up its northern border. It is bordered by the countries of Tunisia and Libya to the east, Niger to the southeast, Mali and Mauritania to the southwest, Morocco to the east, and it also borders the region known as Western Sahara to the west. Western Sahara currently holds a complicated political status, but we'll get into that later in the episode. Algeria's demographics are complicated. Most people in the country share partial Arab and Amazigh DNA. The Arabs are the dominant ethnic group through much of the Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula. The Amazigh, or more often called Berbers, are an ethnic group indigenous to much of North Africa. While most people are a mix between the two ethnic groups, many in the country choose to identify, either culturally or linguistically, as only one of them. It is believed Arab-identified people make up the majority, with Amazigh-identified people making up 20 to 30% of the population. Most people will either speak Arabic or one of several Amazigh dialects. French is also widely spoken in the country, primarily in business and government, as a holdover from France's colonial rule in the country. In terms of religion, most Algerians are Muslim, with the majority practicing Sunni Islam. There are small minorities of Ibadi Muslims and Protestant converts living in the country, but at least 95% of the country practices Sunni Islam. Human habitation in Algeria began tens of thousands of years ago, with many prehistoric cultures existing in the region. The Amazigh ethnicity would develop and form the main inhabitants of the region by the time Phoenician traders arrived in the early 1st millennium BCE. The Phoenicians are hard to explain, but to quickly summarize, they were a group of traders based in modern-day Lebanon that established trade contacts across the Mediterranean world. They would establish several trade cities along the coast of North Africa, most famously in modern-day Tunisia with the city of Carthage. The Carthaginians would establish political, economic, and military control over much of northern Algeria. The Amazigh quickly integrated themselves within Carthaginian society, with the Amazigh making up the largest part of the Carthaginian army by the time of the Punic Wars with Rome in the 200s. After Carthage was defeated in the First Punic War in 241 BCE, Carthage found itself unable to pay off many of the mercenaries and soldiers that made up most of the Carthaginian army, sparking a revolt. This proved to be the first major example of significant Amazigh defiance towards the Carthaginians. Many Amazigh were not directly ruled by Carthage, but instead by client kings that held their own land. One of these client kings, Nationalist, began to unify several Amazigh tribes together, and in 202 BCE formed the Kingdom of Numidia. During this time, Carthage and Rome were fighting the Second Punic War, which would ultimately end at the Battle of Zuma. Nationalists decided to defect from the Carthaginian side and join the Romans in driving the Carthaginians out of Amazigh land. Nationalists managed to form a sizable kingdom, taking control of most of northern Algeria. Numidia would remain close with Rome, acting as essentially a puppet state in the region. There would be a war between the Numidian king Jugurtha and Rome in the late 2nd century BCE, but Numidia for the most part would grow closer before eventually being absorbed into Rome proper by 40 BCE. The Romans would rule northern Algeria, primarily using it as a breadbasket for the empire. There would be small-scale Almohade resistance to Roman rule, but nothing to challenge Roman rule until the end of the empire. Many forts would be established along Roman Africa's southern border to maintain control of the region. Christianity would be brought into the region, and by 300 CE, most of the population had converted. This included one of the most famous Christian theologians, St. Augustine. Augustine would prove to be instrumental in setting up medieval and even modern Christian thought, such as original sin, just war, and a rejection of earthly desires. However, Roman rule in the region would end with the invasion of the Vandals in 435. The Vandals were a Germanic tribe that originated from southern Poland, but had been pushed west by invasions from various other Germanic and Hunnic groups, eventually moving into Iberia, where they then crossed the Mediterranean and invaded North Africa. Vandal rule was defined by religious tensions and violence between the Allan Christian Vandals and their Trinitarian Christian subjects, but they also held arts and science in high regards. The Vandals would be defeated by the Eastern Roman Byzantines, who would take control of the region in 534. Byzantine rule would be short-lived, as by 711, Algeria was under the rule of the Arab Caliphates. These Caliphates helped establish greater connections from Algeria to the Middle East, brought an influx of Arabs into the region, and introduced Islam to the region. While at first relations between the Amazigh and Arabs were good, as both fought to remove the Byzantines from power, and with many Amazigh converting to Islam, tensions began to mount. The Arabs held most political control, and increased their taxes on the Amazigh, treating them like second-class citizens. Many Amazigh began to convert to Ibadi Islam. While there are many differences between Ibadi and Sunni Islam, the most important difference was the fact that Ibadi Islam promoted the belief that if the caliph or the head of the Muslim world was unjust, then you were supposed to overthrow them. The idea of revolting against an unjust authority found a lot of support among the interior Amazigh tribes, and by the late 1770s, an Ibadi state was formed. The Ibadi Rustamid dynasty took control of most of central Algeria, fought on and off with the Tunisian-based Aghlabids, and established strong trading connections with sub-Saharan Africa. The Rustamids would be overthrown in 909 by the Tunisian-based Shia Muslim Fatimid dynasty. Many of the remaining Ibadi would flee south, settling around the city of Mazb. The Fatimids would extend throughout the Muslim world, taking Libya, Egypt, Sicily, Mecca, and the Levant by the 970s, and moving their capital to Cairo. Also important to note is Algiers, the capital of Algeria, and where the name of the country is derived from, was founded at this time. The Fatimids left power in Algeria to an Amazigh family known as the Zirids. The Zirids would push west for the Fatimids and slowly gain influence in the region. By 1008, the Zirids, following a similar path to the Fatimids, had gained power in Tunisia and moved their capital there, giving authority to much of Algeria, the Hammadids. However, 6 years later, the Hammadids would declare independence, with the Hammadids and the Zirids feuding and fighting each other for the remaining 11th century. Both dynasties would be severely weakened by an influx of Arab tribesmen entering the region in the late 1000s. These Arab tribesmen, known as the Banu Hila, had originally been based in Saudi Arabia and were forced to move into North Africa by the Fatimids after they had sacked Mecca. The Fatimids wanted to both remove the Banu Hila from causing more trouble in Saudi Arabia and use them to punish the Zirids and Hammadid dynasties who had broken off from them and practiced Sunni Islam. The Banu Hila devastated the region and ushered in massive demographic change. They greatly increased the Arabization of the region, handicapped the Zirids and Hammadids, and led to areas that previously were agricultural hubs being turned into pastoral land dominated by nomads. Both kingdoms would be taken over by the Almohad Caliphate by 1158. The Almohads were based in Morocco and overthrew the previous dynasty, the Almovids. The Almohads believed in a strict fundamentalist version of Islam, placing greater restrictions on Jews, Christians, and non-Sunni Muslims based in their territory. They had expanded throughout North Africa, taking as far as Tripoli in Libya, and holding on to Muslim conquests in southern Spain. The Almohads began entering a slow decline after a series of defeats in Spain by crusading Christians at the start of the 13th century. In 1229, the governors of eastern Algeria and Tunisia, the Hafsavids, declared independence, while in 1239, the governors of western Algeria, the Zaynids, declared independence, forming a kingdom around the city of Telmacen. The Zaynids and Hafsavids, along with the new Moroccan dynasty, the Miranids, fought for control of the region, with the borders being fairly flexible as rival kingdoms fought each other. Telmacen grew its prestige as European traders used the city as a base in order to get African and Arab goods. The Spanish at the start of the 16th century began establishing bases along the coastal region of Algeria in order to raid Muslim states in the region and gain access to gold. In 1516, the Ottoman pirate Hadrian Barbarossa captured Algiers from the Spanish, starting Ottoman rule in Algeria. The Ottomans by 1580 captured all of Spanish, Telmacen, and Hafsavid land in Algeria and had given control of the territory to a pasha that ruled for the Ottomans. These pasha would be appointed by the Ottoman Sultanate but still held autonomy until 1671. By this time, local officials upset with Ottoman rule rebelled and instead set up a Dey to run Ottoman Algeria. This left Algeria in the Ottoman Empire but with significant autonomy and was pretty much its own independent country. During this time, pirates operated out of Algiers, with these pirates being given the name the Barbary Pirates. These pirates would harass Christian shipping and coastal communities throughout the Mediterranean, even as far as Iceland and Ireland. Many Christians would be brought back and serve as slaves or be ransomed off for gold. Around 1 million Christians are believed to have been enslaved during this time period. However, it's important to note that slaves in Ottoman territories had a varied experience, with some being forced as galley slaves, where they would be forced to practically live in one spot for years on end. However, others would convert to Islam and become high-ranking officials or even pirate captains themselves. The Barbary Pirates' raiding of Christian shipping would often cause retaliation from Christian powers. At various points from the 16th to 19th century, the Spanish, French, Danes, Dutch, British, and Americans would launch expeditions to raid Algiers. A Spanish bombardment in 1784 and a British bombardment in 1916 permanently weakened the Barbary Pirates' ability to raid and weakened the Ottoman Algerian state. In 1830, the French would invade Algiers. The invasion was publicly stated by the King of France, Charles X, to be about putting an end to Barbary piracy and to avenge a diplomatic incident where the Dey of Algiers hit the French ambassador with a fan. However, the invasion was also privately used as a way for the increasingly unpopular Charles to hopefully gain support of the people as domestic politics in France became increasingly divisive. The invasion was successful, with the French taking the city of Algiers and removing the Dey from power. However, as Charles had sent the military away, Paris revolted against his rule, and with no soldiers to fight the protesters, resulted in his overthrow. The French conquest didn't end after the fall of Charles, as the invasion was widely popular among many in France, with French leaders also recognizing that by capturing Algeria, it increased their prestige in Europe itself. France would slowly continue to push further into Algeria, often meeting resistance from the locals and resulting in bloodbaths with many thousands dying in the conflict. Perhaps one of the most famous resistance fighters was Abdelkader el-Dajiri. He led Algerian resistance against the French from 1832 to 1847, at one point building a proto-state that controlled a significant portion of the Algerian interior. Abdelkader would eventually be forced to surrender after French and Morocco troops had surrounded his territory and with little chance for success. Abdelkader would later spend time as a prisoner in France before being eventually allowed to live in Damascus, where he would save many Christians during sectarian violence in 1860. The French would continue to take more and more more land until 1903, when they eventually took the southern town of Tit. The French conquest brought about unprecedented change in Algeria. The conquest had killed many, with estimates ranging from 800,000 Algerians to 1 million Algerians dying. French colonists, known as the Pied Noir, arrived in large numbers, with around 1 million living in the country by 1960, making up 10% of the population. France officially treated Algeria not as a colony, but as a part of metropolitan France. This meant that laws based and written for France itself would directly affect what happened in Algeria. France believed that if given autonomy, Algeria would drift apart from France and would therefore become less French. France wanted to assimilate Algeria into France. This did allow Algerians to vote if they became citizens. However, in order to become a citizen, an individual had to revoke Islam. While there was limited democracy and local government, it was entirely dominated by French settlers and the small numbers of local Christians and Jews. French rule in Algeria modernized much of the country. Modern secular schools were set up in Algeria towards the end of the 19th century. Infrastructure was improved and modern agricultural techniques were brought in. Algeria's population had exploded with 2.9 million in 1875 to 11 million in 1960. However, these changes did come at a cost. While secular education was brought over, Islamic schooling that had taught most of the country how to read and write lost much of its funding, with the remaining schools teaching mostly in French and not the native Amazigh or Arabic. Infrastructure also improved around the major ports, but roads and railroads didn't connect towns to each other. Instead, resources were connected to ports so that these raw resources could be exported to France. While only a couple minor revolts and battles took place in World War I, Algeria provided a very important role in France's war effort. Algeria provided France with grain and food needed to feed the troops fighting all throughout the world. Around 300,000 Algerian men left Algeria to go to France to either work in the factories or fight in the front. Those that worked in the factories importantly made close connections to the political left in France. After the war, many Algerians had hoped that U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's arguments for self-determination would lead to greater autonomy in Algeria and help kick off the Algerian Nationalist movement. Nationalist movements in Algeria were divided into three phases. The first were the young Algerians. They were liberal moderate Algerians who received their education in secular French schools. They argued for an Algeria that had greater political liberties for Muslims and that had greater autonomy but was ultimately still in France. They had convinced the French authorities to give greater political rights to Algeria after World War I, but still for most Algerian nationalists proved to be too little. The next group were conservative Islamists. This group argued that Algeria should embrace an Arab identity and fight for traditionalism within the country. They also didn't want full independence, but did want Algeria to be different from France. They strongly opposed the influence the French language had in the country and sought to increase the spread of Arabic throughout the country, which proved to be highly successful. They formed the Association of Algerian Muslim Ummah in 1931 and would continue to promote an Arab and Islamic identity in the country until it was dissolved in 1956. The last group were the leftists led by the North African Star. They were influenced by their experience with the left in France and fought for a welfare state to be set up in Algeria, greater workers' rights, greater democracy, and political independence. They successfully used mass mobilization to try and achieve their goals. Algerian nationalism has been growing since the early 20th century. It was temporarily put on hold at the start of World War II, with Algerian nationalists deciding to work with the Allies to defeat the Axis in hope that they would be rewarded. Much like after World War I, the French gave limited reforms to the Algerians, but still suppressed Algerian nationalist organizations and refused to entertain the idea of Algeria leaving France. The Sétif and Goulma massacres were in 1945. French colonial authorities and white settlers killed some 6,000 to 20,000 Algerians, showed to many Algerians that violence was the only way they would achieve independence. France introduced a bicameral legislature with an upper house represented by whites, Jews, and French-educated Muslims, and a lower house represented by the remaining Algerian Muslims. However, elections to this legislature were believed to be rigged. Algerian nationalists led by the National Liberation Front, or FLN, kicked off the Algerian War with a series of bombings aimed at police and military targets in 1954. The Algerian War would be characterized by rural insurgency and terrorism by the FLN, and counterinsurgency and brutal repression by the French military. Both sides committed numerous war crimes, such as French soldiers massacring entire villages in the Algerian countryside, or Algerian nationalists committing terrorism against any Algerians who they suspected to be aiding the French. Note this also included those simply working in low-level administrative jobs, or those who didn't publicly express support for the nationalist cause. Torture and death was common, with somewhere between 350,000 to 1.5 million dying during the war, with the vast majority being civilians. The French Republic collapsed in 1958, with a coup bringing French war hero Charles de Gaulle to power. De Gaulle was brought to power in the hopes that he would lead the French to victory in Algeria. However, de Gaulle recognized that Algeria couldn't remain in France, and slowly began the process of making peace in Algeria. Whites in Algeria and many in the French military felt betrayed, with some forming the Secret Army Organization, or OAS, to try and use the FLN's tactics to force the French to remain in Algeria. But French rule had proved too unpopular with the average Algerian, and in a referendum held in 1962, 99.7% of those who voted for Algeria to become independent, ending the war. Around 900,000 whites and Jews fled the country, along with several thousand Muslims who had supported French rule in the immediate aftermath of the war. Algeria found itself under the rule of the FLN. The FLN was mostly made up of Algerian nationalists and Arab socialists, although the party has a very Big Ten approach to politics, having a wide range of political beliefs represented. The first president, Ahmed Ben Bella, led the country until he was overthrown in 1965 by Hararu Ben Boumediene, with assistance from the army. Ben Boumediene began nationalizing oil production in the country and increasing the power of state industries. The FLN hoped to increase industrialization of the country, much to the detriment of the rural economy. Algeria, which had previously been the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, now began to import food into the country as more and more emphasis was placed on the oil industry. Under Ben Boumediene, Algeria also began to crack down more and more on dissidents, and the army grew to hold greater political power. The Arab identity in Algeria grew more and more powerful in the country. Amazigh speakers began fearing that with the increasing prevalence of Arabic, that the Amazigh languages would suffer. Resistance to Arabization was particularly fierce in the region of Kabela in northern Algeria. In 1963, a group of FLN members split, forming the Socialist Forces Front, or FFS, who fought for an Amazigh identity. They were persecuted by the central government, with many members being jailed and executed. Today, the FFS does exist, with it holding limited political power in the country. Algeria also found itself facing off with Morocco. Morocco pursued a policy of irredentism, attempting to increase their territory across the Maghreb. They claimed parts of Algeria near the northern Moroccan border. In 1963, Moroccan forces crossed into Algeria, starting the Sand War. While the war was mostly inconclusive, with no changes to the border, it severely impacted Algerian-Moroccan relations. Both states would and still remain hostile towards each other. Algeria in the 70s expressed support for Swahili nationalists who were fighting for the independence of Western Sahara from Morocco. Even today, many Swahili refugees live in Algeria, with Algeria officially recognizing the Swahili state of the Swahili Arab Democratic Republic. Algeria began to suffer from instability starting in the 80s. Algeria relied heavily on the price of oil remaining high and continuing to be profitable. However, an oil gulf dramatically reduced the price of oil, resulting in recession in Algeria. Algeria found itself increasingly unstable, with a rise in Amazigh nationalism, a desire for free democracy, and an increasing number of Islamist organizations. While previous Islamists in Algeria had been far more moderate, these new Islamists were inspired by the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. The Islamists found the government less willing to crush dissidents in the mosques themselves, allowing dissident groups to use the mosques to organize and give their political discussion a much more religious tone. In 1988, riots broke out in Algiers, forcing the FLN government to allow for multi-party democracy. Many new political parties were formed, with one of the largest being the Islamic Salvation Front, or the FIS. The FIS won the parliamentary election in 1991, winning 47% of the vote. The FLN, the next biggest party, only won 23% of the vote. However, the army stepped in and intervened, calling off the election, and the military took control of the country. FIS politicians and supporters were arrested. Guerrilla forces were quickly established, and the Algerian Civil War began. The Algerian Civil War shares many similarities with the Algerian War against the French. The FLN government used brutal methods of eliminating any of those who opposed them, and disappearing those who spoke too negatively about the government. Islamist guerrillas used terrorist attacks and indiscriminate killing against those they felt were working with the government. Within the Islamist guerrillas, a split began to emerge in 1993 between those who wanted to negotiate with the government and try to come to an arrangement, found themselves under increasing pressure from the more hardline members of the insurgency. The hardliners would break off from the FIS and formed the Armed Islamic Group, or GIA, and took to massacring anyone, including those that remained in the FIS. The GIA became infamous for both the hijacking of Air France Flight 8969 and a series of massacres that occurred in several villages outside Algiers. In 1995, General Lamine Zurel was elected president, with him being supported by the quasi-liberal Democratic National Rally, or RND. Zurel would quickly be succeeded in 1999 by Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who won 74% of the vote. Now, it's important to note that Algeria during this time, and even to a certain extent today, was run by the military, with the elections that took place likely being rigged. The government continued its repressive ways, although they did open up the country a little bit, allowing moderate Islamists and opposition parties the chance to participate in elections and win seats in parliament. By 1999, many FIS fighters had chosen to give up on the war after being promised amnesty. The GIA suffered a split, with the new group, the Salafist Group for Preaching and Combat, or the GSPC, emerging. The GSPC opposed the widespread massacres of the GIA, although they continued the terrorist attacks. The GIA grew increasingly unpopular, and by 2002, the GIA had lost all of its influence. Between 1991 and 2002, around 100,000 Algerians had died during the fighting. Terrorism in Algeria hasn't ended, with the GSPC, Al-Qaeda, and other Islamist groups continuing on the insurgency. The latest insurgent attack occurred on February 9th of this year, killing an Algerian soldier. Bouteflika continued to run the country after the Civil War, with his rule lasting from 1999 until 2019. While elections did occur during this time, turnout was low, and registering as a candidate was often difficult unless from the FLN or RND. Algeria, like much of the Arab world, became engulfed in the Arab Spring, with protests breaking out in 2010. While more than 11,000 protests took place in the country from 2010 to 2012, the protests failed to bring about real democracy, and only received minor concessions from the government, such as lowering the price of food, giving greater representation to women, and ending the state of emergency. However, the FLN and the army's monopoly in power was still kept. Many Algerians were fearful of a repeat of the civil war in the 90s, or following Syria or Yemen into widespread violence. However, Bouteflika was overthrown in 2019. Bouteflika, who was in his early 80s and had been rarely seen in public since 2010, was considered by many Algerians to be too old. When he announced that he would be running for a fifth term, which the Algerian constitution forbids, many decided to protest. On March 3rd, it was believed somewhere around 3 million people took to the streets. Bouteflika was forced to resign by April 2nd. So is Algeria a democracy now? Not really. The FLN and the army still remain in control of many of the political institutions in the country. The presidential election in December 2019 ended with Abdelmadjid Tebboune being elected with 58% of the vote. Turnout for the election was less than 40%, with some opposition members suggesting that less than 10% of the country actually voted. Protests continued after Bouteflika left, with small-scale protests continuing on until March of 2020, when the coronavirus ended protests in the country. It is unclear if once the pandemic is over, protests will return. So why does Algeria exist? Algeria has always had a very dynamic history. Many kingdoms, empires, political factions, and organizations have fought over the country, attempting to take the wealth the country holds. Right now, the biggest question is what will happen after the pandemic is over, and will the current government hold on to power, or will something new take its place? We'll just have to see what happens in the coming years. The next country on our list is Andorra. We'll have our first microstate, and a very weird one at that. Prepare for butchered Catalonian, French, Spanish, and a very weird system of politics. Thank you for listening. My email is whydocountriesexist@gmail.com. The sources I used are About History's article, Medieval History of Algeria, Alrat al-Sad's documentary, Heartbreaking History of Algeria, French Occupation, Extremism, and State Terrorism, Al-Arabia's article, Suicide Attack Kills Algerian Soldier Near the Mali Border. This is Baris's video, The Brutal French Conquest of Algeria, Cogito's video, Who Are the Berbers of North Africa, the Cold War's video, Arab Countries Post-World War II, Epimetheus' video, History of North Africa Explained, Foreign Policy in Focus's article, Algeria and the Arab Spring, Geography Now's video, Algeria, The Great War's video, French North Africa in World War I, Let's Talk Religion's video, Ibadi Islam's third major branch, Mr. History's video, A Super Quick History of Algeria, a lecture from my Poli-Sci 308 class, African Political Systems, the Orient 21 article, Algerians in the First World War, the Revolutions Podcast Season 7, and Wikipedia.